To begin, I'd like to thank everyone who has made a presentation today. I wish that all the resources that you represent had been available to us when we were beginning the bow. Because when we were starting the bow, this type of discussion was in its infancy. And in many respects, we were feeling our way. The chart I'm about to show you is one which I'm sure many of you have seen time and time again, and it's something that's provided by Autodesk in their promotional material, and it's a handy little thing because it does explain and very succinctly how working with BIM, for example, can organize your information flow and realize real efficiencies in the design and implementation process. And that last curve represents an optimal achievement in terms of the design information availability and when that design information is going to make the biggest difference to you as a designer and as a project manager, for that matter, in controlling your costs going through the design process. Zeidler was an early adopter of Revit, and we used the product probably as early as 2002, 2003, but mainly as a design enhancement tool. We weren't taking projects from beginning to end in that using that software, and we were just gaining an appreciation of its power. Prior to embarking on the bow, we had made the decision to implement Revit throughout our offices worldwide, and we had sort of implemented that strategy in about 2004, and we had agreed intra-office that we would each select a large project, a fairly complex project within each office, and do it from beginning to end with Revit, and try and engage as many of our sub-consultants in that process as we could. And that was a very, very successful exercise, and it gave us an opportunity among ourselves to exchange a great deal of information about our successes and our failures. And the interesting thing about that was that it focused us on as a project development tool. And it's interesting about this chart is that it ends at the operations point of departure. So, you know, it was evident that when I just sort of circle at the OP part of the chart, which is at the dead end of the axis, and I believe that this is telling about Autodesk and the thinking that had gone on at the stage when we were adopting Revit. They really hadn't taken it much further beyond the completion of a project. They hadn't moved it at that time into the realm of real operations considerations. And so that would correspond roughly with the stage where we were embarking on the bow. And so, you know, this is another one of their diagrams, which everyone is familiar with. And again, it kind of ends at where the the real issue of this gathering is focused, which is on the operator and manager. So when we started in 2005, it was just before Christmas, we had a situation where we had a client, Encana Corporation, a project manager that they had hired to assist them as the owner by the name of Matthews Group. And then they proceeded to hire the team to do the project. And Foster and ourselves were thrown together, in a marriage which has turned out to be a very rewarding and very, very enjoyable experience. And the project began. Obviously, we needed to get to a early stage design. Foster was working in MicroStation, which is a Bentley product. We were working in Revit. They don't talk, and so consequently, we were redrawing everything and re-inputting everything that Foster was delivering to us. And so it became apparent to us all that our integrated design approach had to be truly that. We had to be joined at the hip from the very beginning of the project. And so consequently, large portions of the project were meted out to those that appeared to have the most experience with those particular building elements. And consequently, our team had done many, many high-rise tower buildings, and we were very familiar with the kind of technical demands of core design. And the Foster folks weren't quite as familiar with that, and so we took the core, they took the shell, and we took the entire subgrade as design packages, if you will. One of the most important things that we had to do at the very outset, of course, was to establish that we could build a building large enough for Encana, and so that was one of the things we needed to move towards very quickly, was a sort of a footprint and configuration that would give them all of the attributes of a building that they wanted, which was many, many floor plates of cellular offices, very little open plan. And so we started to do area calculations and extract that data from our early design schemes in order to confirm and convince Encana that they were going to get what they needed. We then had a team of sub-consultants, and as it turned out, none of them had adopted Revit. And so we were dealing with a design consultant that wasn't working in a 3D package that we were working in, and all of our sub-consultants hadn't yet adopted Revit. And so it was beginning to be a bit of a challenge to integrate all the information in both Revit and in AutoCAD. So to begin with, I don't know, this thing seems to be running away with me. Does anybody know why? Huh. Maybe it'll stay put. So we had an owner eventually. Encana was the original owner occupier. They weren't familiar with BIM. The eventual owner, H&R REIT, wasn't familiar with BIM at the outset, and Synovus, who became another principal tenant of the building, was not either. And Matthews Development, the project manager, was not as well. So all of those people in the sort of the decision-making category were unfamiliar with the whole process associated with utilizing building information modeling. As I mentioned, our consulting team was only partially familiar with Revit, and all of our sub-consultants began the project without Revit. And the only ones that were sort of present with Revit through the course of the project were Gensler, who were our design partners on the interiors. So we were constantly translating information and integrating it, which actually turned out to help us a great deal. It didn't help either that our constructor didn't have any familiarity with it. So that was so we actually then, as the project progressed, adopted a design assist program with Supreme Walters for the steel component of the project, and then 2 suppliers of curtain wall, Antimex and Soda, who also had worked in 3D softwares. So that was very good because we were able to move the project forward in a relatively integrated way with their assistance. We had specialists working in 3 dimensions as well with RWDI on the environmental side, and TransSolar, who were doing all of the interior environmental analysis. Now, this is a lot about building owners and this early stage of the project. We were moving along quite happily. We were getting a buy-in from our client on the design, and Encana and Matthews seemed to be quite happy with the progress that we were making in getting our approvals with the city. At which point, H&R REIT entered the picture and purchased the project from Encana. And in a very, very quiet way, sort of began to influence the course of events. And that quiet aspect changed very quickly. We started our construction of the foundations in January of 2008, and we had placed the order for the steel probably in about February of 2008, and in March of 2008, H&R decided that they were going to take the building design such as it was and the approvals that we'd achieved and expand 37 out of 58 of the floor plates within the shell of the building. So it didn't influence an expansion out beyond the skin of the building, but it did increase the floor area by 120,000 feet. That was an economic consideration, and we effectively had to revisit every aspect of the design. And it was worrisome because the steel was being fabricated and for loading and structural dynamics that had just changed quite dramatically. There were other events throughout the project which influenced us in a very similar way, but to focus on that change in floor area, and I'll explain how that was achieved, we had to redraw the entire building, and we had to do it very, very quickly. So completely redo the model and essentially start from scratch in all the calculations. The next thing that we couldn't stop construction, so we were moving forward into completion of the excavation, development of the anchor pad, which was a 3-meter slab of concrete at the base of the excavation. And we had to continue to advise our steel fabricators about the areas of their contract that they could move forward with while we were rebuilding the model. Now, all of these various aspects of the building were changing, and you can see by this small diagram that what had been an atrium space between the outer skin of glass and the interior of the blue line, the arced line, became this condition here. So the owner had recaptured all of that space within that arc. And so we had to revisit all of the decisions that had been made with respect to the diagrid, which is the external structural frame, all of the relationships that were established with the vertical transportation, because we had different head counts, different populations on every floor. We had a raised floor throughout the building, all which was now being dragged towards the new window wall. We had to completely recalculate and redistribute all of the air distribution systems, and the partition systems and the ceiling system. So this was a major change, and we had to continue construction. So to continue with this list of BIM impacts, we were then getting our structural frame above grade, and shortly after that, Encana and Synovus decided that they were going to become separate corporations. And so that meant that we now had 2 head offices within a single structure, and all of the interior space planning that we had done to accommodate a single corporate entity now became 2 entities, each with different cultures and each with different demands. And again, the BIM came to our rescue because we were able to completely reconfigure the interior design within a space of time that enabled us to serve the owners and the tenants' interests. But all of this happening on what was otherwise a very tight schedule. Now, Gensler was now moving into a stage where they were starting to work in Revit as well, so that helped us quite a lot. Now, how does that change the building section? It meant that what had been continuous atria spaces behind the outer glass were filled in to the window wall, and we were left with 6-story atrium spaces at intervals in the building, where we had continuous atria up the entire building, interrupted only by those purple fat floors there and there and there. You can imagine that the concept of our atriums was such that we were going to have convection air currents up through the building, collecting warm air and distributing it across the building at the fat floor levels, and distributing the warm air down the north side of the building to temper the office conditions on that side. So that was the strategy going into the project. we then had to bring TransSolar back to completely redevelop the interior air movement patterns that we had originally established as the basis for calculating our air handling capacities. And so they did a complete reanalysis of the temperature within our atria, and then that fed back into the recalculation of the motor sizes and the fan capacities and so forth. So again, one of those situations that goes right back to the very root of our basic assumptions. And then, of course, in a fairly early stage in that process, we had to completely recalculate all of the area requirements and determine very quickly that this was a feasible thing to do, and convince the new owner that in fact this was going to result in significant benefit financially. And again, working with Revit, we were able to pull off those revised area calculations very, very quickly. So at this stage in the project, just as we're getting the structure out of the ground, we've already revised the building twice in a very significant way, and we have had some pretty surprising turnaround times using Revit as our principal vehicle for making those changes. Now, it did have an impact on the schedule. We probably lost about a year and a half in the schedule because of those changes. But it could have been much, much worse. So what happened was we had an original early occupancy date right here in sort of late 2010, which got pushed out to August of 2000 and, let's see, what was that? I guess it was September of 2012, I'm sorry, 2011. So we lost a year in that process. And so I think that if we had been doing it through a conventional production process, we would have lost much more time than that. So what we had, in order to pick up on that schedule, we had to standardize the building, and we used a structural model that if you have any questions about it, Blaine can probably answer them, because he was associated with Barry Charnish and the Yawley's team at the time, and so we built the model so that we would be reassuring ourselves at every point that we were avoiding clash detection, or achieving clash detection with our mechanical systems. And we had to do the population of the model with mechanical and electrical, because our MEP group weren't working in any three-dimensional software at all. And so that was a task that we undertook, to isolate those elements and to ensure that the structure and all the other architectural aspects were fitting in comfortably. And then we had to revisit the lower level of the project, even though we had committed to a structural approach which had 6-story high columns where we were able to achieve a grade relationship on the site long before we were able to actually create the parking structure below it. And that was a real benefit to us. And the other thing that we were able to do very quickly was to revise access and egress from the parking structure and the logistical center that was located below 6th Avenue, and reconfigure all the ramps to correspond to new conditions that had arisen because of both the structural changes and the corporate changes that were occurring. And once we were able to do that, we could re-embark on the manufacture and the placement of the heavy steel diagrid sections at that faced the Southwest Plaza. Now, again, we were using the BIM models very, very extensively in order to study all of the conditions that we were encountering with the double curtain wall and the influence of the wind loading that was creating a requirement to provide these very, very complex structural elements, which we call drag struts, that prevented the exterior structure from peeling away from the interior structure, and in high wind conditions and so forth. And you can see the portion of the building that we were studying is right here at that junction between the outer skin and the inner wall. Thanks. Getting into the tenant improvement side of the exercise, we, as I said, had to sort of now create 2 head offices within the single structure. And we had to completely redesign the offices of Synovus in order to satisfy their new corporate culture. And that worked out quite well, and the model helped us very much, because as you can appreciate with the diagrid, it's a very dynamic element that affects every office space within the building that encounters the diagrid. And so we were able to take every office and determine what impact the diagrid would have on it, and satisfy the clients in a very rapid way that every office that did have a diagrid element in it was going to be satisfactory in terms of how it would be furnished and the amount of natural light that would be received within it. Now, as I said, Encana is a culture, a corporate culture, that requires that all of their senior staff have cellular offices. So that was something that drove the entire plan of their floors, whereas Synovus wanted to do all of their floors in an open plan. So we had to completely reconfigure and revise how the air handling systems and the partition systems worked for each of them. Now, what results is these large atrium spaces that provide a wonderful panoramic view of the mountains and enable us to to do extensive planting within those atrium spaces and create a work environment which has, for each of these major corporations, something akin to a village square, where the vertical transportation, the express elevators bring people, the staff, to these village square levels. We call them sky gardens. And then from those village squares, the staff move up into their neighborhood business units or office areas. And so these sky garden floors become the place where coffees are sort of picked up in the morning on the way to work, and you get your copying done on the way to your office, and you meet your friends and colleagues, and then you continue with your day. And the same event occurs at lunchtime and in the evening. So the sky garden floors become very key to the entire sort of cultural and working experience. Now, as far as the fit out of the office levels, we were working with Technion and working with their inventory system and their manufacturing schedules to ensure that we were going to be able to meet the deadlines for each of the corporations. And we were able to integrate Technion's inventory system with the BIM inventory that we were developing. So now we have pretty much filled the building up to about the 44th floor, and we're continuing with the completion of those floors above that. But what we're discovering going forward is that the owners and the project managers and the constructor have not, in the 7 years that we've been working on this project, adopted Revit or any other three-dimensional software. And so now that we're approaching that sort of particularly critical moment of project closeout, we really don't have anyone to receive the model in its final form, despite the fact that we've been actually updating the model throughout the entire process. So it's a bit frustrating, because we actually feel that in many respects, despite the gaps in the model that are within the sub-consultants' areas, this model could be very useful for project or for building operations. But there's a lack of interest on the part of the building operations people, because they still continue to be completely unfamiliar with the potential of the model that's been created. So nonetheless, we have sort of continued to move forward, defining those objects that have or partially have been modeled, and yet for a lot of those very important objects or components, we haven't had any tagging done. So these are the areas in which we've sort of been able to sort of achieve the model, and so we have got obviously the architecture and the interiors covered. We have nothing from the standpoint of mechanical, electrical, or plumbing systems, and structural by the end of the project had caught up with their Revit input and been able to do things like clash detection and so forth. in the coordination stages. However, the experience has been fantastic for us, and now we're trying to revisit this whole issue with H&R, who are the owners and the operators. And they're a very lean organization, and despite the fact that they have a huge portfolio of assets, they still don't see the need to move into this new realm of management technology. But we're working on them, and I think that it's mainly, as Tony pointed out, it's mainly that cost aspect which is probably going to move them towards a positive decision with respect to engaging more fully in this. And because we have a hunch that because they're using a very, very traditional form of property management for all of their facilities, they're losing millions of dollars a year. Now, what I'd like to know from some of you who may have experienced this is, how do you reverse engineer this model to accommodate all of the information that's missing? And how much would this exercise cost? Does anybody have any experience with respect to estimating that? What would the likely period of time be to do a re-engineering job for mechanical, electrical, and plumbing? And it's very difficult to determine what their savings would be. Now, we have a similar situation arising and giving us a real opportunity to take some of the lessons learned and some of the experiences that we've had and apply them in a subsequent project, which is our Calgary City Centre project down in Eau Claire. And we're hoping that the lessons learned are things that Cadillac Fairview, who are our client and building operator, can put to their use. So this is what we look forward to with them going forward in that 2-tower project, which is probably about 1.5 million square feet. I think I overshot my time.